first technique that we're going to be doing is just simple coloring with your markers. So I'm going to use my Memento ink pad. It is a dye ink pad, but it's water resistant. So it's a good ink pad to use when you're just coloring. You could use the Stays On pad if you want, because it's not going to move at all. But if you're just starting out, want something that's easy to clean off of your stamps, the Memento is a great one to go with. So I'm holding my stamp in the center so it doesn't shift, and I'm just pressing around along the outsides just to make sure that I've got a good impression. So typically before I color, I'll let this sit for about 5 minutes just to make sure that it's good and dry, and I happen to already have one on the other side here. So when I am coloring here, I'm going to start, so I'm going to do my rows here. I'm going to start from the lightest color. And like I said in the introduction video, I'm coloring fairly quickly because I want to give that paper as little chance to pill as possible. And you can just color flat, just one color if you want, but it's fun to add little bits of extra color, like especially when you're doing flowers. Often flowers have different hues of each color, so it's fun to add little pops of another color. It just makes it a little bit more interesting. But you definitely don't have to if you're more comfortable starting out and not, oops, the darker one here. If you're more comfortable starting out and just using one color for each thing, you can absolutely do that. The other thing that you can do is there is a colorless blender, which is a marker with clear ink in it. So you can take your marker and you can scribble it on some plastic and then use that colorless blender to blend your color in a little bit. So when it's blending it in, it's going to start dark and then it's going to go light. And once again, you still want to make sure that you're coloring quickly so you don't start tearing up that paper, but that is an option to use. You can tell, well, now it's got pink on it, but I actually don't typically do that very often, so my marker is in pristine condition there. So I'm going to color in my little buds here. And I typically go and color the entire part that I want with that particular color and then move on to the next color. I'm just going to flick in some dark where that bud hits the greenery there. And it's all personal preference with color. When I'm doing flowers, I typically do more pinks and purples. Yellow is actually my least favorite color, so I don't really use it too often, but I figured I should use it for this one because I thought it needed a little bit of extra color to it. So the yellow on that flower there, and I'm just gonna flick in, this is like a dusty rose color. And by flicking in, all I'm doing is pressing the marker at the bottom and then flicking it up so that it's not just one straight stroke like this, it's more like that. There we go. Now let's get to some of the greens. I'm going to start with my lighter green, and I typically start with a lighter color, and then I will add my accents with the darker color. So all of that. And these leaves are fairly small. You probably don't even need the extra little accent of the dark. I'll put the dark right where the leaf meets the stem. But I do think it makes it look a little bit more realistic when you have a little bit of a shadow there. So I'm going to add the shadow right again where the leaf meets the stem. That ended up being more of a square than I intended. Also putting a little bit of a shadow beneath that little flap of the leaf there. And this particular stamp is a fairly loose drawing. You'll notice there's a leaf that goes right in front of a petal. I think that's supposed to be a petal there. So when it's a fairly loose drawing, I'm usually fairly quick and don't really do a lot of detail coloring when I'm doing it. You noticed I missed a couple leaves there. I think that's supposed to be a petal as well. I did it on the first one. So let's go back and add some of that light pink there. So typically what I would do, oh, there's my mat right there. Typically what I would do is I would add it to, or glue it to the mat, which I can do right now. And then I would glue it to the front of the card. And then my last step, because it takes a little while for it to dry, my last step is to add some stickles. So stickles are a little bit of a glitter glue, but it has a really fine point to it, so you can get some nice detail to it. So I'll add some stickles to the image, and then I set it aside to dry. And if I'm still crafting, I make sure to set it aside where I can't reach, so that I don't accidentally put my next piece over top of it to dry. I've done that before. That's the voice of experience talking there. The other thing to know about stickles, you can cover an entire area with it, but because these markers are dye-based, I'm going to stick this just aside to dry. Because these markers are dye-based, when you add stickles or glossy accents with some colors, it completely changes the color. So get to know your markers a little bit. If you're concerned about the color changing, test it on a just a scrap piece of paper. I use this one because I know that this one changes drastically. There's a huge difference between the actual color of the marker and what it changes to when I put glossy accents on it. It's not so bad with the stickles on it, but just be aware that it does that. The other thing too, because it's a dye-based marker, if I were to put the stickles or the glossy accents over two different colors, they would start to run together. So another thing to be careful of. The one thing that I haven't done, and I will show you, but I'm going to avoid the areas that I put stickles on, is I like to take a really, really pale gray. This one is N95, and I'll put all the marker colors that I'm using on the supply list for you so you know exactly what colors I've used. I just outline the image, and it's something that if you didn't know it was there, most of the time most people won't notice, but it tends to put a tiny bit of a shadow behind it and it makes the image pop a little bit more. You'll notice on this one where I put it, you kind of, that area kind of pops just a touch more. And it's one of those things you don't really know why it's doing that until you realize that it's just outlined with a little bit of a light gray color. So just something to keep in mind. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it's something that I like doing, and I find it makes my images pop a little bit more. So I'll see you in the next video, and I'll show you another technique.